Welcome to the webinar series, All Confessions. So this is part one about business analysis. My name's Ian Gotts, so thank you for joining me for this short half an hour webinar. You will be sent the recording of this and the deck. If you have any questions, then I'm happy to take those if you just put those in the chat. And of course, at the end, there'll be contact details with some links to some useful resources, but also so you can contact us. So All Confessions, I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Some of you may have read some of the confessions. I've actually read all of them, and it's very easy to become quite negative. You only see the zeros, you never see the ones. And there's a great deal of good being done out there, out in the ecosystem. And what we did was we did some root cause analysis to understand why some people are not having the success that they deserve. And we found that there were some 4 root cause analysis at the very heart of the problems that we're seeing in All Confessions. The first is business analysis. So that's why we're focusing this webinar series on the different issues that people see around and cause the All Confessions. And this one's all about business analysis. So the first question is, why should I even worry? What's the value of business analysis? Well, as I said, All Confessions, when we look across the 650 odd confessions, poor business analysis and poor architecture are at the root of over 200 of those confessions. So that's why we want to try and address this. And as I said, future webinars will deal with some of the other issues, documentation, DevOps, and user training. So that's the first reason for getting good at business analysis. It will help you avoid some of the problems, some of the nightmare scenarios in terms of implementing Salesforce. The second is, and third and fourth are all really related. Business analysis is how you engage your end users to make sure that you understand what they really need. Engaging them in a way where they come to you and say, this is how we should change it. This is what I need to do to improve my business. But often they don't come to you with very clear ideas. And the clearer that you can get the requirements and really understand what the problem is that they're trying to solve, the better app you will build and the better adoption. And whilst everyone thinks about adoption as being great training, actually great adoption starts by having really clear requirements. So you're building the application that the customers, your end users, really need, not what they thought they wanted. And the fourth benefit, which is related to engaging end users, it is very difficult sometimes if you're fairly junior or inexperienced to be able to say no. Someone senior comes to you, says that they want a new pick list value or they want a new record type. And inside your brain is screaming, no, I don't want to do that. But you don't have the skills to push back. You don't want to say no. You want to say yes. So business analysis is a great way of actually saying yes, engaging those end users, but then end up building the correct answer, not what they are demanding that you build. And the fifth reason for business analysis is career development. Burning Glass did some research looking at about 300 million job vacancies a couple of years back. That work was commissioned, I think, by Salesforce. Business analysis was the #1 requested skill. Also, if you look at if you go to the trailhead and you look at the relative salaries of the different people, business analysts gets paid more than an admin. If you want to become an architect, then business analysis is a key skill. If you want to be a consultant, be paid even more, then business analysis again is a key skill. So in terms of building your career, if you have any aspirations to get beyond an admin who's purely configuring the changes that are being suggested by someone senior, you need business analysis. So there's a tools gap and a skills gap. If we look back to 1999, which was when I was sitting in using Salesforce in the early days, it was a tactical CRM. And now it's a strategic platform. It is not just a few customer records. It could be built, you could build anything using Salesforce. And the problem was we have this idea of uncontrolled agility, the citizen developer with relatively few skills and tools. But we need to get up here to a situation where we're agile and compliant, where we actually have a managed development cycle, and business analysis is a key part of that. So again, as members of the ecosystem, we need to climb up this skills and tools gap, and business analysis and the other two webinars will talk about the skills that you need to gain to be a far more valuable member of the ecosystem. So this is the view of business analysis for many people. It's feedback, statement of work, suggestions, random wishes, a few gems is what people are sent, and then they configure, code, and test. And we have to break that cycle. We have to make sure that we do some good business analysis and understand from this slew of suggestions, what actually is it we need to build? And that's where business analysis comes in. We need to capture requirements. When we're getting these raw requirements coming in, we need to map our business processes to validate the requirements and identify new ones. Only then, when we've done that and we've got our final requirements, can we then write user stories, and those user stories then get passed to be able to code and test. So capturing requirements and mapping business processes are an iterative cycle, and I want to show you how that works, and then we can start to write really crisp user stories. So let's start with requirements. A requirement should go through a life cycle from being raised through to being implemented or will not implemented or deleted. And sometimes you need to go back for more information. So there is a life cycle of a business requirement. And so there's essentially a workflow. And what we need to do is several things. First of all, we need a central location to go and capture all these requirements. Email is not a great answer. Maybe trying to track them in an Excel spreadsheet is, but again, people have got beyond spreadsheets. This is 2020. So we ought to be thinking about applications for starting to capture and manage all those requirements. The next thing to do is triage them. People are coming out with some weird and wacky ideas. Some of them are simply wish list items. Some of them are genuine requirements. So we need to triage them. And then we need to validate them. So we talked about how we would use the business processes to start to validate which of those requirements are correct. And then we need to prioritize them. So group them into a release and then deliver them as working code, as configured applications. So let me just show you how that might work in practice. So this is Elements Catalyst. This is our requirements page. And you can see it looks like a massive, great spreadsheet. We have the idea of what's the request, why is it, what is it required for, is there a business priority, is there a business impact, is there a business risk, when is it required by, why do we need it, and maybe some tags so we can start to in some way prioritize them or group them. And the example I want to look at is purely associated with our service processes, because that's what I want to look at the moment. So I can see here under service, I've just filtered that. I've now got a number of requirements. How do I refund a customer? How I need a new record type, product recall. I need to assess GDPR, CCPA being the new Californian regulations. We need self-serve modification. We need better visibility of solutions. So that's typical. It's a set of requirements of different levels and varying levels of detail. So let's take those requirements. If I took any one of those requirements, let's take a look at that one. Is there any linked information? Then there's no information. There's no discussions associated with it. What about this one? Okay, that seems to be linked to a process diagram. So someone is starting to identify where this new record type should be used. Now, I don't believe we need a new record type, but let's see how we can start to validate some of these requirements by looking at the processes. So before I launch into those processes, let me just talk about the principle of process mapping. So for many of you, when you think about a process map, you think of a flowchart, something like this. And I mean, flowcharts have been used by millions of people over the last 10 or 15 years. But there is a way of improving on the way flowcharts work. And it's something called UPN, Universal Process Notation. It's a very simple notation, doesn't require any particular product. It's just a different way of thinking about things. And it's really based on the fact that the world has moved on and we have a different audience who wants to consume information in a different way. So the first issue is that this is quite complicated and it's actually quite a big diagram. I think there are 18 boxes on there. So if I take exactly the same diagram, and that is exactly the same information. In fact, there are fewer boxes, there are just 9 boxes, and there's more information than that flowchart using this universal process notation type of idea. So let's just drill into this for a moment about exactly how this notation works. First of all, every activity starts with a verb. Request, test, analyze, fix, resolve, confirm. Secondly, every box has a line into it or out of it, and those lines have text. So the question is, why is that important? It's important because I need to know when a particular activity is completed. I resolve the technical support request and I keep on going unless I find a new issue or I have resolved it. When I test a new issue, I keep testing it until I can reproduce it, or if I can't reproduce it, I go back for more information. So you can start to see here, the lines are really important because they actually talk about the handoffs in a really accurate way. I can't start analyzing the issue unless I can reproduce it. If I can't reproduce it, it needs to go back to the customer for information, and I don't start again until I've got more information. So with our flowchart from the previous slide, a lot of the text didn't have lines on them. So it was quite difficult to know when a handoff was. The other people say to me, it's like, well, hang on, where are the diamonds? I need questions. I need decisions. Well, there's a decision that happens here. We test the issue and we either can't produce it or we can produce it. So implied inside that diagram, underneath that box, is a decision. And that's the next thing about these diagrams. To keep them relatively small, but still support a whole ton of information, we're able to drill down. So anything with a corner on it means there's a lower level diagram. You can drill down to the next level of detail. Another way to actually attach more information would be the paperclip. So again, we're adding all that supporting collateral to these boxes. And why is that important? It's important because we've got several audiences. The first audience is we obviously need to use these diagrams to engage our end users to find out what they really need. So think back to that requirement. Someone said, we want to deal with product recalls. Well, I can see that nowhere on here is there any process about a product recall, but the requirement was we need a new record type called product recall. Well, there's a bit more implied in terms of managing a recall. If we're sending a product back, are we going to refund the customer? So maybe the front end is we're dealing with the customer in terms of saying, yes, we'll send the product back, but there are a whole series of back-end processes to actually deliver on that, giving them an RMA number, tracking that, tracking the product got delivered. When it did get delivered back, then refunding the customer and confirming the customers had to refund it. So there's a lot more implied than just we need a new record type. So this is why business analysis is so important and why the process is so important, because it helps us understand, validate, and build out new requirements to make sure we've really thought everything through. So that's the first audience. The first audience is the end users. They're out there saying, we need to understand, we need to be able to engage them to understand what they need. The second audience is the end users, because this could be training material. We could deliver this back to them and say, if you want to understand how the service process works, here we've written it down. You can click on any of those attachments and it will take you to the collateral you need. And the third audience could be the regulators. There may be, if you're in a highly regulated industry, there's regulatory compliance. And this is what the auditors will look at and say, can you prove that your team are following this process? So if we have these different audiences, we need to be able to therefore deliver it in a way that they can understand, no matter what level of seniority, and no matter what level of what discipline they're in. So we need something that's really simple that everybody understands. So these flowcharts tend to be big and unwieldy, particularly with swim lanes. If we start using some of the more complex technical type notations, with 300 different shapes, which all mean something different, then we lose virtually everybody in terms of the audience and their understanding. So let's look at this in practice. Let me just go to Elements, and I go and look at a process diagram. So there is that process diagram. So the first thing is you can see that this is the draft version, but I've actually got a published version as well. So there's some version control associated with that. The other thing, we can start to see that if I click on that paperclip, I can see it's attached to a couple of metadata items, so I can see what in Salesforce has been configured to be able to do this. I can see that I've got notes here to how to handle objections, and I've got a link there to a support site. So if I'm an end user looking at this from a training perspective, I can click on some of those little paper clips, and they're helpful for me. And if I click on, say, a drill down, I can now drill down to the next level of detail. And I can now start to see a more detail step by step. So you can start to see now we've got something which is far more sophisticated than, say, a simple flowchart, but it is, it's easy to understand. Everybody can understand it. My suggestion, if you've simply got, often I see people who write processes that look like this. Let's go into edit mode. A process that says, support, maybe spell it correctly, support, recall, another one there that says test solution. Okay, that's what people call a process. And to be honest, that is a better process than that. At least that means we don't know what we're doing. This is so confusing. That's not a process. That is a process. And as we start going through this process of and understanding that requirement, which said we need to do a product recall, maybe we need to start thinking about, well, there's a new process up here which actually is coming out of here as a request to return product. So we now need to issue RMA, and there are a series of follow-on processes. But now I can start to go, okay, well, what requirements are now linked to this? Clearly, there's a requirement associated with here. If we're going to request to return a product, then that supports maybe the website. If I click on there, I actually need to go and add a new requirement here. So we need to update support site so customer can request return. So we're already identifying new requirements which we wouldn't have thought of because we're now thinking about the process. Here, maybe there's a new requirement. Well, there are some existing requirements, so let's just have a look at see if under service, let's filter by service. Okay, so we need maybe with that one there, and they're the two requirements which are related. They're not necessarily correct, but at least we've now captured them. And maybe we need to go and add a new requirement which is associated with issue RMA. So you can now start to see how we are building up our list of requirements, and we're starting to identify what the process looks like. Let me just take 2 seconds and think about where else this could pop up. This process diagram, not this one, but the signed off, the published version. So let's look at the published version. That published version could pop up inside Salesforce. So if I go to a case here, I don't know how a case works. A couple of places I could either embed that process diagram inside a Lightning component. So now as an end user, I can understand how to do things. Or with pop-up help, I could pop it up inside or attached to either an object or a field. So this is where we're starting to see the value of creating great process content because it's not just a way of engaging the end users. We're validating the requirements, but we're also using this as training material. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to thinking about what user stories are. The good bit is that obviously the recording of this is available for everybody, but also we've written some I'm not allowed to call them trails. We've written some training which steps you through everything I've talked about. So you can actually dig into a lot more detail. So let's go back to user stories, which is the third component. So the first thing is there's a standard format that people use for user stories. Think of a role, I want to, what do you want to do, so that I can, what's the outcome? That's simple as I want to, so that I can. That's the standard way that we write user stories. So the first thing is there will be many user stories associated with a requirement or a process. So thinking about our service example, as a customer who has only just bought a product within its warranty period, I want to return it. As a customer who's had a product and it's now the warranty is expired, I want to return it. As a customer who's got a product which has a recall on it, I want to return it. So you can see there could be many different user stories associated with what seems like a very simple process flow. So the thing is, we can link these user stories back to requirements, and we can link them back to the process diagrams. Because the thing is, the user stories is what your development team are going to use to start to build out the application or enhance your application. And if you can link a user story back to a process diagram, back to the requirements, you're giving them more context, you're giving them more information. Now, you could build these user stories inside Elements, but often your technical teams are using other applications. They're using, say, Jira, for example, because Jira is a more sophisticated application for building those user stories into sprints and tracking them. So therefore, maybe there's a synchronization of your user stories into Jira. But the most important thing is that you are building those user stories built on solid information. So you're building it based on a clear understanding of your requirements and then some well-documented processes. So if I click very quickly, just go back into Elements, just thinking about how a user story would look. So how do I refund a customer? I could create a user story straight from here. Summary is, for out of warranty customer, as a sales management, I want to track non-warranty returns so that I can, what would we do? For non-warranty customers, sales management, we want to track them so we understand implications of selling extended warranties. You may put some acceptance criteria in there. You may even target it to a release. I could tag this as service. So again, when I'm starting to do my filtering, and it's linked to the how do we refund a customer. So I've now created a user story associated with this requirement. Now, user stories don't have to be linked to requirements. They can stand alone. A requirement may have user stories. User story may be linked to requirements in a different way. So this is not about just using Elements. This is about the principle of you need to capture requirements. You want to build out those process maps to validate the requirements, and then you want to build out those user stories. Those user stories with Catalyst can then be integrated, synchronized with Jira, so then your development teams can use them. But then you've got that traceability from requirement process all the way through to what got changed inside Salesforce. So that's the next webinar, which is next week, which is talking about how we take these user stories, how when we start making changes to our org, we can start to document our org, and understand the implication or the impact of any of those changes. So we've looked at the purple boxes today: capture requirements, map processes, write user stories. The next webinar is going to talk about documenting your configuration and impact analysis. Third one is about training and feedback. And we have some resources for you. If you want to go and play with Catalyst, you can go to the App Exchange, install it. It will set everything up for you. We have built a training there called the Agile Business Analysis, which will be up there by the end of the week. There's a link there to an article about why flowcharts are so 1980s. And obviously there's the Org Confessions site and Org Confessions the movie. So that's a very quick sprint through some principles there of how you get capture requirements, map processes, and write user stories. I'll stop the recording here, but I'm happy to take any questions.